On today's episode of the Carolina Sports Guy, we're going to look at what could have been. We're talking about the University of South Carolina's basketball, a move from leaving the ACC, going rogue, finally joining the SEC. Now, if you're not a member or subscriber, please do so. It doesn't cost anything. Subscribe to this channel. Uncle Chucky greatly appreciate it. Carolina Sports Guy here. Please hit that bell notification to be notified of other future content. Carolina Panthers, Carolina Hurricanes, Charlotte Hornets, and major college sports in the Carolinas. And please pound that like button and leave some comments below. All right, folks. Carolina Sports Guy here. Just kind of was looking back at the history, and being that really I'm a North Carolina guy. When I started this channel, I said, I can't leave out South Carolina. Anytime being a Panther fan, you look at the state, and training camp's been held in South Carolina. It's 2 states, 1 team. And then the Hurricanes play in Raleigh, but I like to feel that South Carolina's adopted team as well. Until you get baseball in the Carolinas, I had to wait and see. Probably a lot more Brave fans in South Carolina than North Carolina, but it's probably about the same. And basketball, I think there's some South Carolina people who are Charlotte Hornet fans being in close proximity to the state line. But colleges is where things are split. In South Carolina, you're normally either a Gamecock or a Tiger, because you got Coastal as well. And of course, in North Carolina, you got the Big Four: Carolina State, Wake, Duke. And you got East Carolina, Charlotte, Davidson, Appalachian State. You can go on and on and on. But South Carolina basketball. Now, they, like North Carolina and Duke and Wake and other schools as well, Clemson, are in the Southern Conference. And, it dates way back. But South Carolina basketball was a conference champ for the Southern Conference. And I talked about this with Davidson. After many of these schools left, Davidson dominated the Southern Conference in the 60s. Well, South Carolina, they're 1927 Southern Conference champs. 1932 Southern Conference champs, 1934 Southern Conference champs, and then the 1945 Southern Conference champs. So they had some pretty good runs in the Southern Conference. 1953, like Clemson, like the 4 big schools in Carolina and Maryland and even Virginia, they joined the ACC. Frank McGuire, who had won a national championship for the University of North Carolina in 1957, had moved on from UNC, and by the early 60s he takes this role, trying to turn South Carolina around. You can imagine the athletic department of South Carolina thinking, man, here's a guy who won a championship for North Carolina. We've had some success. Maybe we can lure him into South Carolina and see what we get. He was very successful in the early 60s. So he coached the University of South Carolina from 1967 and 1976. He had an overall record of 205 and 65. Now, as successful as South Carolina had a good team, and they were. They definitely were better probably than Maryland and Virginia and even Clemson. Having to compete with North Carolina, Duke, and NC State, and even Wake Forest was a difficult task. They were the 1970 ACC regular season champs. They went undefeated. But they did not go to the NCAA that year because they lost to NC State in the championship game. And a lot of those championship games were played in Charlotte or Greensboro. And the Big Four North Carolina schools always made it hard and heckled the South Carolina fans. 71, they do beat University of North Carolina in the ACC Tournament championship and win their only ACC basketball championship, the tournament. So they represent, the University of South Carolina represents the ACC in the ACC at the NCAA tournament. Now, from 71 to 74, they do 4 straight NCAA appearances. This would not have been if South Carolina did not leave the ACC and go independent at the end of 71. If they stuck around, not saying they wouldn't have won the ACC in 72, but chances are for them to win the regular season, especially winning the tournament, maybe they would have done it in 72. But I doubt they would have done it in 73 or 74. But you never know. Now, they were led by John Roche And he was a 1970 and 1971 ACC first team. He was a 1971 ACC Player of the Year. He was a consensus All-American in 1970 and 71. He would go drafted by both the NBA and the ABA. He decided, because he was from New York, he played in the ABA for the New York Nets in 71 to 74. After he was drafted by Kentucky, they traded his rights to New York. And then a year later, after 74, leaving the New York Nets, he played for the Kentucky Colonels. Goes to the Utah Stars of the ABA in 75. Finally gets in the NBA in 76, playing for the Lakers. Finished his playing career for Denver in the NBA in 79 to 82. By far, probably the greatest notable player, played at the University of South Carolina. Bobby Cremins, former head coach at Georgia Tech, also played on this team with John Roche, was coached by Frank McGuire. Great teams in the late 60s, early 70s from South Carolina. Gave North Carolina, NC State, Duke and Wake, gave all the ACC schools a run for their money. Now, the only thing of note other than when they left the ACC in 72, 73, 74, and they made the tournament being an independent, and they did have some good teams, because remember, players went to this school based on their being an ACC school and how dominant they were, and even though they pulled out of the ACC, these players were committed to the University of South Carolina. And the most notable player I can come up with, who played on the 1975 South Carolina team as an independent, was the great Alex English, who played his NBA career for the Denver Nuggets. He was an All-American. But it's kind of a big drought other than that. But you go back and look at the 1969-1970 South Carolina Gamecocks. 25-3 record, 14-0 in ACC play. My gosh, folks, incredible team. If they wouldn't have been upset by NC State in the in the ACC tournament. 70-71, record's not as good. They're 10-4 in the ACC. They're 23-6 overall, but they get to go to the tournament because they beat University of North Carolina for their only ACC tournament championship. Now, the heckling done. When South Carolina would go on the road, it's one thing to play Clemson at home or even on the road and being an ACC rivalry in your home state. But when they cross that line of Tobacco Road, playing North Carolina at UNC, playing Duke, playing NC State, and even playing Wake Forest, man, the South Carolina players, the coaches, the fans, anybody rooting for South Carolina got heckled. The Big Four made it hard for South Carolina. Fans were intimidating, heckling. They threatened, fanned the flames a lot of games, made it very difficult, very hard for South Carolina to win. And a lot of people look back and people have to wonder, you know, just a short time ago, about 10 years ago, however long it's been, when Maryland decided to leave the ACC and they moved on to the Big Ten, they're sure money and being affiliated with a school like Penn State with a rivalry. The ACC had a cozy deal with the ACC in history. And I know the Big Ten and the Big Ten Network, before the ACC Network come along, it's going to pay Maryland more. But man, traveling to Nebraska and Minnesota and Iowa, cannot tell me Maryland does not miss playing North Carolina, Virginia, and the like, you know, NC State, a lot closer. But having Penn State as a rival, and the money had a lot to do with it. But one has to wonder if Maryland didn't feel left out, much like South Carolina did, maybe didn't feel the heat as much when South Carolina decided to leave the ACC in 71. Like I said, 71, 72, they go 24-5 and they reach the NCAA tournament. 72, 73, they go 22-7, not as good of a record. But again, because they're independent, they go to the NCAA tournament. 73, 74, they're 22-5. Same thing, they're independent, they go to the NCAA tournament. A couple of these years, they probably, like I said, they don't make the tournament if they're in ACC unless they win the tournament championship, because the ACC would only send one school, like all the other conferences at this time. The NCAA did not have at-large bids. So after suffering for a little over a decade and being an independent, remember, football was the driving force behind this. They wanted to be the Notre Dame in the South in football. And they weren't as good in football as they thought they'd be. It didn't take much for the football coach, athletic director Paul Ditzel, to persuade Frank McGuire to leave. Frank McGuire was kind of fed up with the North Carolina ACC schools and said, yeah, we'll leave. And it panned out with the NCAA tournament. They still had a good team. But not having that conference affiliation in the long run definitely hindered and hurt South Carolina in sports, especially basketball. They've never been the same. So they joined the Metro Conference in '83. And for 8 years they played in the Metro, and it was just mediocre basketball. Nothing really to brag about or look great upon. That's what it was. And then in 1991 they joined the SEC. Since they've joined the SEC, I think they've won the SEC once, maybe twice. They've been to the Final Four in 2017 in the SEC, where they got beat by Gonzaga, who ended up losing to North Carolina for the championship. So they can't get away from the Carolina schools even at the Final Four, even when they're in the SEC. A notable note to make is Bill Foster coached South Carolina from 1980 to 86. Where did he leave? Duke University, where he coached Duke to the Final Four in '78. He left Duke in '80, goes to South Carolina. Dave Odom coached Wake Forest and had them number one in the country for a while. Had them a Final Four candidate. They never made it past the Elite Eight with Tim Duncan, but he goes and coaches South Carolina. Dave Odom did 2001 to 2008. So South Carolina really, Frank McGuire was at Carolina, goes to South Carolina. Bill Foster at Duke goes to South Carolina. Dave Odom, Wake Forest, goes to South Carolina. So a lot of ties there. So one good thing you can look though at the SEC champs, 1997, they were in basketball, but they're also the 2005 and 2006, both years, NIT champs. So being in a predominant conference, even though the SEC is mainly football, and that's what they're going to thrive on, South Carolina's first football. The one thing other than that rivalry with Clemson that you can definitely say is, getting back in a major conference from the ACC to the SEC has helped their basketball program at least kind of go back up. Because at least if you're in a conference with Kentucky, and even Florida's won a couple of national championships in basketball, you can kind of say, well, we play some pretty good basketball talent. Okay. So, what do you guys think of today's video? Do you think South Carolina should have stayed in the ACC? How big a mistake do you think it was with them leaving? How long do you think it took? Do you think they should have tried to get in the SEC quicker than they did? Not that maybe that was their choosing. But leave me some comments below. Hit that bell notification to be notified of more videos like today. Pound that like button. Let me know you like this video. And by all means, folks, subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. And we'll see you next time on another episode of the Carolina Sports Guy.